What is going on, movie fans? Welcome back to another episode of the J Area Podcast, where my name is Jose Ramos Jr. And as a lifelong fan of movies, this is where I share some of my personal favorites as well as my own thoughts on each film. And for this week, I promised that I would be revisiting one of my favorite films of all time, certainly my favorite slasher film of all time, with that being 1996's Scream. Scream is definitely a film that helped revitalize the slasher genre in the 90s. There was a point in time where it was the most popular genre in Hollywood, with movies like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and Friday the 13th coming out. But over time, more sequels were coming out, and these sequels weren't as good as their predecessors. So it began to fall out of favor with audiences. But with a movie like Scream, and introducing its meta-commentary and its self-referential moments in the film, it definitely helped create a new wave of slasher films. It was released December 18th, 1996, directed by Wes Craven, again known for his films like The Hills Have Eyes, Last House on the Left, and of course, A Nightmare on Elm Street. With a star-studded cast that included David Arquette, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, Matthew Lillard, Skeet Ulrich, Rose McGowan, Jamie Kennedy, Drew Barrymore, and Liev Schreiber, many of these stars weren't the stars that we know them today. But over the courses of their career, we would become more familiar with their work, and it's very interesting to see that a lot of them got their starts here with this movie. As for a short synopsis for the film, set in the American town of Woodsboro, Scream's plot follows high school student Sidney Prescott and her friends, who on the anniversary of her mother's murder become the targets of a costume serial killer known as Ghostface. The film itself had been in development for a few years, as writer Kevin Williamson, struggling at the time, was inspired by reports of a series of murders by the Gainesville Ripper, but also wanted to write some self-referential material that played on the horror cliches of the slasher genre, popularized by films like I mentioned, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. The original title of the film was Scary Movie, but eventually the name Scream was decided upon based on the popularity of Michael and Janet Jackson's hit song entitled Scream, and the title change was because executives believed that the title would insinuate it was a comedy. But now, over the course of a few decades, it's now recognized as one of the greatest horror films and slasher films ever to have been made, and helped reignite the buzz around horror in the 90s. Since then, it has spawned 5 sequels and a short-lived television series. In 1994, Williamson had been watching a documentary pertaining Danny Rowland, aka the Gainesville Ripper, and after noticing an open window in his home, Williamson would arm himself with a knife and actually call a close friend of his for reassurance. The pair of friends would actually discuss characters such as Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, and upon waking up the next morning, Williamson would be awakened by a nightmare and use this idea of a home invasion as the central plot of his next script. For the next few days, Williamson would write the script for his film, Scary Movie. He would do this while listening to the iconic score of John Carpenter's Halloween for inspiration. He even went as far as to draft outlines for possible sequels to this film. He also developed much of this plot based around a single line of dialogue that was actually later used in the movie. It was, quote, "Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative," end quote. At this point in time, the slasher genre had begun to fade due to the oversaturation of poorly received sequels, and Williamson wanted to introduce characters that were not only knowledgeable regarding the genre, but also created a more creative killer and an unpredictable plot. Williamson said, "I thought if you could expose the rules and play with them, then the audience doesn't know what they're going to get. Suddenly they're on the edge. I start playing with the tropes, and the rules were a part of that." Studios such as Paramount and Universal were competing for the script, but Dimension Films would attain the rights and advised Williamson to make minor adjustments to the film, such as less gore, as the scenes included exposed internal organs and severed limbs. Directors such as Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, Tom McLaughlin, who is known for Jason Lives, George A. Romero, and even Sam Raimi were all considered, but ultimately Wes Craven would accept the role of director. As for casting, Reese Witherspoon, Molly Ringwald, and Brittany Murphy were all in consideration for the role of Sidney Prescott, but Neve Campbell would earn the role because she brought a sense of athleticism to the role due to her dance background. They also believed that she brought forward a combination of strength and vulnerability. Campbell was attracted to the role because of its complex nature, transitioning from a tormented, traumatized, insecure young woman to an overwhelmingly empowered and strong woman. It's also said that Campbell was initially hesitant to take this role because she's not a fan of scary movies, but she noticed that one of her former co-stars in Skeet Ulrich was attached to it, so she had eventually said yes. Another interesting note is Courtney Cox was very eager to play the character of Gale Weathers because it was something different she was accustomed to. She was used to playing these nice characters, very friendly. I mean, the obvious one that comes to mind is Monica from Friends. So she was very eager to play someone that was very much so an antagonist and a bully and a villain, essentially, in the film. But the film itself is not lauded just for its cast, but it's also just the direction of the film it takes. There are so many different references and well-done scenes that help make this film stand out, when compared to its contemporaries. For example, the opening of the film with Drew Barrymore's Casey Becker, it's one of the more iconic opening scenes to any movie, not just of a slasher film, but just of any movie. Drew Barrymore at this time was the biggest star connected to this film. She was on all the promotional material. She was in the trailer. She was a well-known name at this point. And to have her open up the movie, we're thinking she's going to be the prime protagonist. We're thinking she's going to be the hero for the film. But what they do in the first, I believe, 10 minutes of the film, they set up, who the killer is. We know it's Ghostface, who is taunting his victims through the phone, asking them what's their favorite scary movie. And we see that there's a young girl, Casey Becker, played by Drew Barrymore, home alone, getting ready to watch a scary movie. It's among one of the best openings in any film because of the suspense, the drama that it brings, and it just continues to build and build and build. And one of my favorite aspects of this scene is the questions that he's asking her, because you're thinking it's just a simple conversation about horror films, but the way he brings his menacing voice, and that is Roger L. Jackson, who's the voice of Ghostface, but he eventually tricks Drew Barrymore's character by asking who was the killer in Friday the 13th, and no hesitation, she answers Jason Voorhees. She's convinced it's Jason Voorhees, but he says, nope, that's the wrong answer, because in the original film, it was Pamela Voorhees. That's a little fact that a lot of folks kind of get, confused because Jason Voorhees is attached to those films. But it's just the sheer arrogance that he brings to the role, Roger Jackson, that is. And when he's speaking to these teenagers, in fact, on the set, he had not met Drew Barrymore or Neve Campbell to that point. So all they had to go off was his voice. And just the musical cue, and again, the direction, the action, and the chase scenes of this film, second to none. I think it's definitely one of the best of its time. I think it's one of the best of all time. After Casey Becker is killed off, you're really left with this sense of what's going to happen now, because initially it was thought that Drew Barrymore was the big name, that she was the big star of the film. And again, the movie itself is very self-referential, but it also pays homage to previous films, because this opener is very much so a reference to 1960s Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, where Janet Leigh, again, was presented as the main protagonist, presented as the hero, and she too is killed off early on in the film, and one of the more iconic shower scenes shown in Psycho. So it's very much so like a love letter and homage to that film. Following that, we're introduced to the character of Sidney Prescott, who is a teenage student struggling with the anniversary of her mother, Maureen Prescott's death. Sidney Prescott's also surrounded with a group of friends, a group of family. Her father, Neil, is actually going to be traveling for work, so he's not going to be here for much of the film. In fact, he becomes a prime suspect because of his disappearance. She's in a relationship with Billy Loomis. Her best friend is Tatum Riley, who's actually in a relationship with Stu Macher. And Tatum Riley's brother, Dewey, is the deputy sheriff and one of the fan-favorite characters of this franchise. She also has a friend in Randy Meeks and is confronted by investigative journalist Gale Weathers. Again, the cast itself is so well-rounded. There's so many different characters to bounce off of and to root for or root against. For example, with Billy Loomis, he really just presents himself as that slimy boyfriend who you initially think is the bad guy. And it's an interesting point because in the film, a red herring is defined as a clue or piece of information that is or is intended to be misleading or distracting, aka Billy Loomis. Initially, we're supposed to believe that Billy Loomis is guilty. Everything he does, it points to him being the killer, whether it's having a phone on him with Sidney right after she's attacked, whether it's just the way he presents himself and his body language and just everything. We're meant to believe it's him. But that's not the case, and we'll get to that in a bit. You also see Tatum Riley, who becomes like the outgoing friend. Sidney Prescott is much more reserved and conservative. Tatum Riley she's a wildfire, and I love the portrayal of her boyfriend Stu Macher by Matt Lillard. He's all over the place. He's hamming it up. It's one of my favorite performances of his. But it's not just Matt Lillard that I'm a real big fan of, because David Arquette is really able to play it up with Dewey. He's the guy you want to root for. He's silly. He's what he is he's well mannered. He means well. He may not be the best, but he's gonna give you his best. And I feel like that's why a lot of people connect with Dewey in these films, because he's just an overall good guy. He's the good guy that they deserve in that town. And speaking of good guys, Randy Meeks, played by Jamie Kennedy, might be my favorite character in this film, just because he's such a fan of film. He's such a nerd. He's such a geek. And I just find him funny. I think his performance here is great. He brings another level to that side. He's not even like a side character. He becomes one of the main characters, because eventually he joins them in the sequel. And I already mentioned about Gail Weathers, who's played by Courtney Cox. She's the investigative journalist who just wants the scoop and will do anything to get it. See, but the film itself isn't just lauded for its star-studded cast, but also the references that it makes, the homage that it pays to its previous films, such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street, the three films that I constantly mention because there's so many influences from those films. In fact, in the scene where Randy is watching Halloween at Stu Macher's house after the party pretty much ends, there's a scene where he's watching Jamie Lee Curtis being hunted down by Michael Myers. And while this is happening, Ghostface is now slowly approaching Randy Meeks. And he's telling Jamie, behind you, Jamie, watch out behind you, which is very meta because Jamie Kennedy telling Jamie Lee, behind you. And just well done, because the way that the score, the theme of Halloween is presented throughout the house, it really puts over the film Scream in a sense, because it's lending itself to the film. It's lending itself to help elevate the scene, help elevate the movie in a sense as well. But it wouldn't be the only Halloween reference made, as the Mackenzies is a name thrown out there. In the beginning of the film, when Drew Barrymore's character of Casey Becker, her parents discover that she's missing, and then they eventually find the body, but the husband tells the mother to call the Mackenzies, which again, if you're a big Halloween fan, is a direct reference to the original Halloween, where Laurie Strode tells the kids she's watching, Tommy Doyle being one of them, she tells them to head over to the Mackenzies' house. So again, a really quick, really simple, blink and you miss it kind of reference, but it's there. And again, it's not the only one that's being made, because Wes Craven even makes a reference to his own franchise. Initially, Wes Craven wanted the bit where Casey mentions the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise to be removed. You see, he believed that her saying that the first Nightmare on Elm Street was great, but the rest suck, would kind of make him look like an egomaniac, kind of would present him as a bit arrogant. But writer Kevin Williamson convinced him to keep it in the film, because he said this is something that real-life fans would actually say about these movies. And it wouldn't be the only time Freddy Krueger was mentioned, as in a scene where the principal is, searching the hallways of the school. He sees the janitor named Fred, by the way, and that janitor is played by Wes Craven. And Fred, the janitor, is seen wearing a fedora and a striped red and green sweater, just like Freddy Krueger, a clear reference to the character himself. But that wouldn't be the only cameo appearance, as Linda Blair from the original Exorcist makes an appearance as one of the reporters. Also, the inclusion of the rules that Randy Meeks introduces in the film is a very real thing. If you watch enough horror films, you would know that you never say, "I'll be back." You never drink, you never smoke, and if you participate in any sexual activities, you're basically putting a big target on your back. And those are just one of the many aspects of this film that I really enjoy, because it really is super meta. It feels like you're in on the joke, and it feels like you're in on the movie, and it just makes you feel closer and more a part of it. The point of the film itself was to address a lot of things. And in terms of the themes of the film, the point of the film was to address the ongoing discussion regarding how television and its correlation with murder and crimes. For example, a lot of people were saying that the The crimes and murder that many were seeing on television or in film was a direct relation to crimes happening in real life. People are emulating what they see on television. And for example, movies, namely horror movies, were being the main culprit by many. They thought that these are the films that are influencing our young youth and encouraging them to do things that are bad. Again, going back to the quote of "movies don't create psychos, movies make psychos more creative." This is the argument that's being made in this movie. But you could also argue that the media is helping facilitate these images. For example, Gail Weathers represents that side of the media that just wants to capture the story and bring in the profits by any means. It doesn't matter who they have to hunt down, who they have to break down to get the story out, as long as it's them breaking the story. Yet it's the very same society that tells us that these heinous acts are a result of the violence being shown to the public. But the media, like I said, essentially facilitates the imagery, and we as the consumers must now decide whether it's appropriate to act or not act upon these images. Essentially, it just comes down to bad people do bad things regardless. It's just that they become more creative as a result, which is what this film is telling us. Another thing about Scream, and some people discuss whether it was intentional or not, but it is a very pro-feminist film in terms of the way it presents its final girl. Sidney Prescott isn't even regarded as one of those classic Scream queens because she doesn't really represent that era of the heroine. She does not shy away. She refuses to become a victim like her mom. She's been belittled for the last year of her life because of all these references to how her mother was murdered and the scandals that Maureen was a part of. And as a result of her mother's death, she does not allow any of this to take advantage of her vulnerability. Yes, it's been a tough year for her, but it doesn't mean that she's not strong. It's important to recognize, to not confuse her vulnerability for weakness, because just because she can be vulnerable doesn't mean she's not strong. And much like Nancy Thompson, we see this level of growth from Sidney as she learns from these experiences and also maintains the very values that we ended up loving about her. Her franchise ended up spanning 5 films because she wasn't in Scream 6. But throughout those 5 films, you really get to see the growth of how each film has impacted and influences her, and how many friends and family she's lost over time. She really feels like a real character, a real person that we could relate to. And I feel like that's another thing that this film really does well, is the legacy it leaves behind, not only by being a well-constructed film and having the social commentary about the media and violence and what movies can do to people. It really reinvented the genre. I mean, the style itself was used in films that came after it, such as I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, Halloween H2O, and The Bride of Chucky. Jordan Peele, he even mentioned that he was inspired by the Scream franchise for his own movie, Get Out, which had its own social commentary of its own. And as a result, Scream helped launch the careers of many involved, whether it was writer Kevin Williamson or any of the actors that I had previously mentioned. It was a launching point. It was a catalyst for a change in a lot of these folks' careers, but also, like I said, the genre itself. And it doesn't even fall back to just the genre. It goes to actual real life, because caller ID, the usage had increased 3 times, 300% following the film's release, because people did not want to have to worry about these kind of menacing phone calls. So it's no wonder why these films were able to resonate with audiences so strongly. And I also think another focal part of this movie, and the other ones that follow as well, was the humor that's injected. I've always said that humor and horror go hand in hand together, because you're able to set up one with the other. If you add enough humorous elements, then you let the audience let their guard down, and then you actually get them with those scares. By adding this sense of levity and calmness, it's just very much like real life, where there are those times where you're going to let your guard down and you're going to have a good time, you're going to have fun, and then suddenly reality hits you right in the face. That's something that you can't replicate. That's something you can't fabricate, especially with these kind of movies. It's like I mentioned with The Evil Dead and how Sam Raimi is able to interject humor and horror, where you set one with the other, as in humor, you get them with the jab being the humor, and then that right hook is horror. That's how you get those real scares. You can't fake genuine laughter, and you can't fake, genuine scares. Those are two visceral reactions, two visceral feelings that tie into one another. They're basically on the same plane, on the same scale, just on the opposite ends of one another. And now as I dive deeper into the film, I realize I didn't really give away the ending. And in a sense, that's a good thing, because if you haven't seen this film, which I find very highly unlikely, being that it's nearly 30 years now. But even then, if you haven't seen this film, I strongly urge you watch this movie. And if you have seen the film, watch it again, because I feel like every time I rewatch Scream, I find something new. I find a new little bit of dialogue, a new reference, a new... there's always something new. The rewatch value is fantastic for this film. I think it's among one of the more well-done horror films, and it really shows. I think it's such a good time. I can put this movie on as if it was a comfort movie, which is strange enough to say because it's a slasher, but I never get tired of this franchise. Namely this one. I think it's one of the best movies of all time. No hesitation on that. But I strongly urge you, go out, you rewatch this movie. If you haven't seen it, rewatch it, because I promise you will not be disappointed, as there are still lines and scenes that I can recreate in my head, and it's again, just very iconic. Iconic's the one word I would constantly use for this film, and its influence not only on myself, but on film in general. And again, I think it's one of those films that you need to watch at least once in order to say that you've knocked it off your bucket list. But, as we bring this episode to a close, again, I want to thank you guys for listening in and joining me on these episodes, and just really just allowing me the opportunity to share my thoughts and opinions on these movies and why they're so meaningful to me. And I hope that you guys are enjoying it as much as I am, because every time I have a new movie coming up or a new episode coming up, I rewatch these movies, and it's a good chance to revisit and realize why it is I've become such a big fan of certain movies and why I connect with them in a sense. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, J Area Podcast. Follow me on TikTok. Follow me on Twitter at JustJose_3. This is where I share a lot of my updates regarding the episodes themselves, as well as little clips kind of hinting towards what's going on with the episodes and just sharing random facts about the movies that I'm covering. Please comment down below for some films that you want me to cover, or any ideas you have in order for me to cover on a future episode. Again, I can't thank you enough for the support. I look forward again to sharing that new episode with you next week as we join again on the J Area Podcast. Thank you guys.